The soft shuffle of boarding passengers echoed down the narrow aisle of American Airways Flight 306 from Chicago to Washington, D.C. The cabin buzzed with idle chatter, the scent of jet fuel faint beneath the sterile air of a recirculated atmosphere. Camille Thompson stepped forward with a grace that felt earned, not inherited, her shoulders slightly squared, her eyes scanning for their assigned seats. In her right hand, she held the boarding passes. In her left, the smaller fingers of her 8-year-old daughter, Ava. Ava wore a lavender hoodie decorated with glittering stars and a quiet excitement. In her arms, she cradled a weathered stuffed lion named Leo. She didn't say much as they boarded. Her eyes moved from the overhead bins to the oval windows, wide with wonder. This was more than a flight to Washington for her. It was a journey into a legacy she'd only recently begun to piece together through bedtime stories and framed photographs in her grandmother's living room. Camille led them to row 12, seats B and C. She helped Ava into the window seat and stowed their modest carry-on above before sinking into the aisle seat herself. She glanced briefly around the cabin, an unconscious habit developed over years in corporate America as a black woman who had mastered reading the temperature of a room long before anyone spoke. The glances toward them were mostly neutral, some vaguely curious, but Camille knew the difference between interest and suspicion, between admiration and assumption. She'd been reading that difference her whole life. Ava pressed her face against the window, balanced in her lap. "Mommy," she whispered, "do you think we'll see clouds that look like animals?" Camille smiled, smoothing a braid behind Ava's ear. "If you look closely, sweetheart, the sky always tells a story." It was a poetic thing to say, but Camille meant it. She was bringing Ava to D.C., not only to visit the museums or to see cherry blossoms beginning to bloom, they were going to witness the dedication of a memorial honoring someone Ava had never met, but would spend her life connected to, her great-grandfather, Captain Elijah Thompson, one of the few surviving Tuskegee airmen whose bravery had cut through both enemy fire and racial barriers. Ava didn't yet understand the full weight of that name, but Camille hoped this trip would be the beginning of something more than understanding, something like pride. The boarding continued without incident until a flight attendant approached. She was tall, blonde, her appearance so immaculate it seemed curated. Her name tag read Claire. Her expression, though framed by a rehearsed smile, bore the kind of tightness that Camille had seen before, calculated courtesy laced with subtle entitlement. "Excuse me, ma'am," Claire said, glancing briefly at Ava but directing her tone entirely toward Camille. "We have a family that needs to be seated together closer to the front. Would you be willing to move to row 28? It would really help us out." Camille looked up calmly. I'm sorry, is there an issue with our seats?" "No issue," Claire replied, though her voice dropped half an octave. "The family includes a child with a condition that makes frequent bathroom trips likely. We're just trying to accommodate them near the front lavatory." Camille's gaze drifted down the aisle, where a white couple and a teenage boy stood waiting. The boy, slouched in a branded hoodie and earbuds, didn't appear particularly frail. She turned back to Claire. "I understand the need," Camille said, measured but firm. "But my daughter also has needs. We chose these seats months ago to ensure she would feel comfortable. She's young. Flying can be stressful for her." Claire's smile didn't falter, but the sharpness behind her eyes intensified. "It would be a small kindness." Camille inhaled slowly, steadying herself. "Kindness," she echoed. "Is this the kindness where one family's needs outweigh another's because they're more expected?" Claire's smile flattened into something else. "We've already asked several others," she said. "No one has agreed." Camille had been watching the boarding process. No one had been asked. Or if they had, it hadn't been done with the same firmness now directed at her. Ava tugged at her mother's sleeve, her voice soft but clear. "Mommy, are they trying to make us sit by the bathroom?" Camille reached for her daughter's hand and gave it a squeeze. We're not moving, baby. We're right where we belong. Claire looked prepared to argue further when another flight attendant appeared. She was older, with short gray curls and eyes that had seen more than her uniform would ever reveal. Her name tag read Denise. Is there a problem here? Denise asked. Her voice was calm, but there was weight behind it. Claire gestured toward Camille. They're declining to switch with a family who... Denise held up a hand. What's your name, ma'am? Camille Thompson, Camille replied evenly. A moment passed. Denise's eyes narrowed, not in suspicion, but in recognition. Thompson, she murmured. Any relation to Captain Elijah Thompson? Camille blinked. He was my grandfather. There was a shift in the air. Denise's posture straightened, not with tension but reverence. She turned slowly to Claire. They stay right where they are, she said, her tone definitive. Captain Thompson was a hero to this country. He trained with the 332nd. I had the honor of hearing him speak at a military banquet in '94. He flew missions no one else dared to. If his granddaughter and great-granddaughter are on this flight, they are not being moved. Claire's mouth opened slightly, then closed. She turned and walked back down the aisle, her professional composure visibly shaken. Denise leaned in toward Ava. Your great-grandfather flew through storms and war so you could fly in peace. You stay put, sweetheart. We're glad you're here. Ava stared up at her. He flew real airplanes? He did, Denise said softly, and made the sky a little safer for everyone who came after. As the attendants dispersed and the flight prepared for takeoff, Camille sat in silence. Her heart beat hard beneath her ribcage, not in fear, but in quiet awe. She hadn't expected her grandfather's name to be remembered, let alone to carry weight across generations and industries. And yet, there it was, spoken in reverence by a stranger in uniform, reshaping a moment that had begun as yet another subtle act of exclusion. She glanced at Ava, who was now watching the clouds drift across the window. Camille reached for her hand again. You come from a long line of people who stood their ground, she whispered, even when no one wanted them to. Ava turned to her, eyes wide. Like great-grandpa? Yes, Camille said, exactly like him. Outside, the plane rumbled into motion, preparing to lift into the sky. But inside, something far more powerful had already taken flight. The plane had barely reached cruising altitude when Camille began to feel the shift. It wasn't the subtle turbulence nudging the aircraft or the mechanical whir of the drink cart being rolled down the aisle. It was the air around them. Something intangible, but unmistakably altered. Ava sat still in her seat, gazing out the window with Leo clutched tightly in her arms, her little face painted with thought. The moment between the request to move and the recognition of their name had lodged itself in both their minds like a splinter, unseen, but impossible to ignore. Camille glanced around. Nearby passengers, many of whom had initially looked on with quiet curiosity or dismissal, were now stealing second glances. But they weren't the same kind of glances. There was no longer veiled irritation or silent judgment. Now, there was recognition. Perhaps not of her, but of the story they were tethered to. Not long after takeoff, Denise returned to their row, balancing 2 cups of hot chocolate topped with tiny marshmallows. Her demeanor had softened even more, the formality replaced by something gentler. Compliments of the crew, she said with a small smile. And, Miss Thompson, if it's all right with you, I'd love to speak for a moment when you have time. Camille nodded, her curiosity now outweighing her guarded instincts. Once Ava was busy sipping her cocoa and gazing dreamily at the cotton-streaked horizon outside, Camille slipped out of her seat and followed Denise to the galley area. There, amid the quiet clang of service trays and the hum of the aircraft's engines, Denise leaned against the counter, her eyes studying Camille not with scrutiny, but memory. I wanted to say thank you, Denise began, not just for standing your ground back there, but for reminding us who we're really serving every time we put this uniform on. Camille tilted her head slightly. You knew my grandfather? I met him once. I was a junior flight attendant at a military banquet in D.C. in the mid-90s. He was a guest speaker. Most of the room was filled with brass and polished shoes. But when he spoke, you could hear every breath being held. He wasn't flashy. He didn't command the room with his voice, but he made you feel like you were part of something sacred. Camille felt her throat tighten. Her grandfather had never boasted, never demanded the world remember him. But somehow, in the quiet spaces of memory, he had made himself unforgettable. My father was a pilot too, Denise continued, a bomber pilot in Europe. He always said that the Red Tails, the Tuskegee Airmen, were the reason he came home. He told me that race disappeared at 20,000 feet. Up there, all that mattered was trust. He owed his life to a man with a name he never forgot, your grandfather. Camille closed her eyes briefly. The stories she had grown up with, half whispered over family dinners, carefully curated by elders who had lived through too much to believe the world was ready to hear it all, were now taking root in unexpected places. Did your father ever speak with him afterward? Camille asked. Denise shook her head. He tried, but things were different then. He once invited your grandfather to a reunion. The hotel wouldn't allow black guests. He tried to change venues, but it was too late. He carried that regret until he died. I think that's why I carry it now. For a long moment, they stood in silence. My grandfather never spoke much about the war, Camille admitted. Not in detail. I think he wanted to shield us from the parts that weren't in history books. But I see now that history lives in all the places people forget to look. Denise reached into her pocket and unfolded a small photo. It was faded, the corners frayed. Two young pilots, one black, one white, stood side by side in front of a plane with a red tail. Their arms were slung around each other, faces smeared with oil and exhaustion, but their smiles were real. That's my father, Denise said, and yours. Camille reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as she traced the image. She could see Ava's features in the curve of Elijah Thompson's brow, in the fierce line of his jaw. She saw herself in the way he stood, centered, grounded, unyielding. Thank you for this, she said, barely above a whisper. No, Denise replied. Thank you for carrying the name. When Camille returned to her seat, she found Ava chatting animatedly with an elderly black woman seated across the aisle. The woman had elegant silver locks tied loosely behind her shoulders and wore a maroon scarf that shimmered under the overhead lights. Mommy, this is Dr. Elise, Ava said proudly. She knows great-grandpa too. Camille's eyes widened. The woman extended a hand. Elise Howard, historian. I interviewed your grandfather years ago for a book I was working on. I recognized your daughter's name when the attendants were talking. I figured I should introduce myself. Camille laughed gently, astonished by the day's unfolding serendipities. It's lovely to meet you. I hope you don't mind, Elise said, but I'd love to send you a copy of the book. Your grandfather's quotes are some of the most powerful moments in it. I'd be honored. As the flight progressed, something began to happen. A quiet acknowledgement among the passengers. A shift not just in posture, but in presence. The pilot came by briefly, shaking Camille's hand and offering kind words about the Tuskegee Airmen. A young man seated 3 rows back came forward during a restroom break and shared that his own grandfather had also served. A woman leaned over and said her son was doing a school project on African-American WW2 veterans and asked if Ava would be willing to share what she knew. Ava looked up, proud and eager. I'm still learning, but Mommy says great-grandpa made the sky safe. The woman smiled. That's a good place to start. The flight was nearly over when Denise appeared again, this time accompanied by the captain. Ms. Thompson, he said with a formal nod, we'd like to invite you and your daughter to disembark first. It's a small gesture, but one we make with gratitude. Your grandfather's legacy is something we all benefit from. Camille accepted with grace, feeling the gaze of fellow passengers not as intrusive but honoring. As they walked forward, Ava clutched Leo with one hand and her mother's fingers with the other. She glanced back once, her eyes catching those of the boy who had nearly taken her seat earlier. He didn't scowl or look away. He watched her with something closer to curiosity, or perhaps realization. As they stepped onto the jet bridge, Ava leaned in. "Mommy, I want to tell Great-Grandpa everything, even the part where the lady changed her mind because of his name." Camille smiled, but her voice was gentle. "We'll let him decide how much he wants to talk about. Sometimes the hardest things to remember are the bravest ones." Ava nodded solemnly, like superheroes who don't brag. Camille squeezed her hand. "Exactly." Outside, the early spring sun bathed the tarmac in gold. Their driver waited with a sign reading Thompson family, and as they slid into the back seat, Ava whispered again, more to herself this time. "I didn't know a name could do all that." Camille turned to her, brushing a stray curl from her daughter's cheek. "Some names carry weight, sweetheart, not because of what people say about them, but because of what they stand for." As the car pulled away from the airport, the city skyline rising in the distance, Camille felt the presence of Elijah Thompson settle like a shadow across her shoulders, not heavy, but grounding. The echoes of his name had rippled far beyond what he could have imagined. And now, in his great-granddaughter's wide eyes, that legacy was beginning to take flight again. The early morning sun filtered through the curtains of the Harlem brownstone, casting soft golden streaks across the creaky wooden floors. Camille stood at the window, watching as the neighborhood outside came to life. The street, still half dreaming, stirred with the slow rhythm of footsteps, distant horns, and the hiss of a bus's hydraulic brakes. Ava was still sleeping, curled beneath the patterned quilt her great-grandmother had made decades ago. The child looked peaceful, wrapped in a stillness that only belonged to the very young or the very old. Camille took a deep breath and turned back toward the room, a mug of tea warm in her hand, her mind swirling with memories, realizations, and the kind of reflection that only arrives in quiet, unguarded moments. She hadn't anticipated how deep the roots of this house ran until she'd stepped through its door again. The scent alone, an earthy blend of old books, polished wood, and her grandfather's aftershave, seemed to unlock a vault of forgotten stories. She could almost hear Elijah Thompson's voice echoing through the walls, steady and composed, like the hum of an engine at cruising altitude. In every photograph, every worn floorboard, every framed letter on the hallway wall, his presence lingered, not as a shadow, but as a legacy still very much alive. Later that morning, Camille and Ava stood in the heart of the city, gazing up at the grand facade of the National Museum of African American History and Culture. The building's intricate bronze panels shimmered under the sun, a modern monument built to hold centuries of pain, triumph, artistry, and resilience. Ava held her mother's hand tightly, her eyes wide with wonder and reverence. This wasn't just a museum. For them, it was a pilgrimage. Inside, they wandered slowly through the exhibits, pausing often. Camille found herself surprised by the waves of emotion that rolled through her as they moved from room to room. Here were shackles once used to bind children. There was the trumpet Louis Armstrong had played. One floor down, a wall held the photographs of black pilots from World War II, the Tuskegee Airmen, smiling in crisp uniforms beside their aircrafts, the weight of history unspoken in their expressions. Ava stopped in front of one photograph in particular, her brow furrowed. "Is that him?" she asked softly, pointing to a tall man with calm eyes standing beside a Mustang plane. Camille knelt beside her, taking in the details. She recognized the features immediately: the unmistakable line of the jaw, the posture of a man who'd carried both duty and discrimination with equal strength. Elijah Thompson. They stared in silence until a museum guide, a young man with a voice full of pride and reverence, approached them. "That's Captain Elijah Thompson," he said. "He flew over 70 missions, one of the first black pilots to lead a combat squadron, a real hero." Camille turned toward him, her voice steady but full of emotion. "He's my grandfather." The guide blinked, then looked at her with a mixture of awe and gratitude. "Then welcome home," he said. "Because this museum, this entire floor, your family helped build it, whether you knew it or not." The weight of those words settled into Camille's chest. She hadn't expected to cry, but she did, quietly, without drama. It wasn't sadness, it was recognition, a kind of unspoken acknowledgement that her life, her daughter's life, stood on the shoulders of a man who had been denied so much in his own time, yet gave more than most could fathom. Back at the brownstone, Camille sat with her mother's old journal in her lap. It had been tucked away in a drawer, almost forgotten. Inside were reflections written in delicate cursive, thoughts about raising children during the civil rights movement, about the fear and pride of being married to a Tuskegee airman, about the bitterness of progress that moved too slowly. Camille turned to a page written the day Elijah had returned from his final mission. He walked in silent. I asked him if he was proud. He said no, said he was just tired, tired of fighting two wars, one in the sky and one at home. Camille closed the journal. Her fingers trembled slightly. She understood now what her grandfather had meant when he rarely talked about the war, when he waved off praise like dust from his shoulder. He wasn't just tired, he had been grieving. Grieving the friends he lost, the innocence stolen, the dream of equality that always seemed just out of reach. That evening, Camille and Ava returned to the house just as Olivia was setting the dining table. The cousins had spoken more in the last 48 hours than they had in the past decade. The past had begun to soften between them, not erased, but understood. Olivia had shown Camille some of her latest photography work, portraits of black elders in the Harlem community, each one framed against the places they had helped shape: churches, street corners, barber shops, community centers, a living map of cultural inheritance. "These places," Olivia had said, adjusting a frame, "they're more than bricks and sidewalks. They hold memory, spirit. They remind us who we are, even when the world tries to make us forget." Over dinner, Jeremiah told Ava a story she hadn't heard before. It wasn't about combat or medals, but about how, after returning from the war, he'd been denied service at a diner while still wearing his uniform. How another veteran, a white man he'd escorted to safety overseas, had stepped in, sat beside him, and refused to eat until Elijah was served. "He didn't say a word," Jeremiah recalled. "Just sat with me. Didn't matter what anyone else in that room thought. He knew what we'd survived together. That kind of loyalty, that's rare." Ava listened intently, her hand in her great-grandfather's. "Did you ever talk to him again?" she asked. "Once," Jeremiah said. "He sent a letter, said he named his son after me." Silence fell around the table, heavy with the quiet heroism of that moment. Ava finally spoke. "I think that's the best kind of memory, one you carry in someone else's name." Later that night, Camille stood alone in the hallway, staring at a photo of her grandfather in uniform. She thought about what it meant to belong to a legacy, not a story in a textbook, but something lived, something passed on in quiet conversations, old letters, forgotten journals, and seat assignments defended by strangers who remembered. She realized then that monuments were not always made of stone. Sometimes they lived in the resilience of a child who refused to give up her window seat, in the eyes of a woman who documented lives others overlooked, in the home that held 3 generations of Black excellence, survival, and quiet revolution. The roots beneath the monuments were deeper than she had imagined, and for the first time, Camille wasn't afraid to let them pull her in. The study smelled faintly of old paper and lemon oil, a scent that carried the memory of years tucked between dusty spines and handwritten notes. Camille stood just inside the doorway, watching her grandfather Elijah Thompson's steady hands glide across the surface of the oak desk. He moved slowly, but with purpose, drawing out a worn leather folio from a drawer that had likely held its secrets longer than she'd been alive. He didn't speak immediately. Instead, he opened the folio gently, as though afraid time might crumble the contents into dust. Inside were dozens of envelopes, yellowed and delicate, but intact. Each one had been carefully preserved in plastic sleeves, the names written in careful cursive still visible despite the decades that had passed. "I kept these," Elijah said at last, his voice a low murmur. "Letters that were never sent." Camille stepped closer. "You mean they're from you?" "Not just from me," he said, gesturing for her to sit. "They're from soldiers I flew with. Some are from their mothers, their wives, their brothers. Some are my own, drafted on long nights after missions when I thought I might not see another dawn. They never made it to their destinations, but I couldn't throw them away." Camille pulled one from the stack, her fingers reverent. The ink had faded, but she could still make out the salutation. "Dear Elijah, you don't know me, but my son James wrote about you." She looked up at her grandfather, who was staring into the middle distance as if he could still see the young men these letters spoke of. "That one came after the war," he said. "James was a tail gunner on one of the B-17s we escorted out of Berlin. I didn't know him well, just his voice on the radio and the way he shouted, 'Thanks, Red Tails!' when we turned them homeward. She wrote to you because he didn't come back." Elijah nodded slowly. "She never got to thank him herself, so she thanked me." Camille turned the envelope over, her chest tightening. There was no return address, just a name, a city, and the faintest scent of lavender that still lingered in the paper. "I tried to respond once," Elijah said, "wrote drafts, tore them up. What could I say that would make her grief make sense?" Camille replaced the letter and took another. This one was addressed to "Dearest Clara" and signed by Elijah himself. It had never been sent. "That one I wrote for your grandmother," he admitted, his voice thickening. "During the campaign in Italy, we'd lost 3 pilots that week. I was sure I'd be next. I wrote it to say goodbye. But I made it home, and I couldn't bear to give it to her, because it came from a place of fear, and she never let fear be our story." Camille carefully unfolded the letter and read a few lines aloud. "If I don't make it back, know that every moment with you has been my reason, that the stars above Rome meant less to me than your voice in my mind." She stopped, overwhelmed. Elijah exhaled slowly, as if a weight had been lifted. "There's history in these," he said, patting the folio. "Not the kind they teach in school, not in books or even in museums. These are the stories buried inside the ones they tell, the private echoes of public acts." Camille looked around the room, her eyes settling on the framed photographs along the shelves. Her grandfather in uniform, his flight crew, medals and moments frozen in time. But the letters, they were different. They weren't about glory. They were about grief, love, fear, duty, and the human cost of heroism. "Why keep them hidden so long?" she asked. Elijah chuckled, but there was no humor in it. "Because people prefer their heroes simple, clean lines, no questions, no shadows. But this," he said, tapping the folio, "this is who we were when the cameras weren't looking." That night, Camille couldn't sleep. She sat in the guest bedroom she'd once played in as a child, listening to the creaks of the old brownstone and the rhythmic breath of her daughter sleeping in the next room. Her mind was tangled with the letters, the lives, and the truths her grandfather had carried in silence for so long. In the morning, as the house filled with the scent of pancakes and the sound of jazz, her grandfather's Sunday tradition, she found Zora curled in the armchair beside Elijah, leafing through the folio with wide, respectful eyes. Great-grandpa said I can help organize them, she said proudly. We're going to make a book. Elijah grinned. She's got your stubbornness. And her great-grandmother's attention to detail. Camille joined them, a cup of coffee in hand, and watched as Zora carefully slid a letter into a labeled sleeve. It struck her then. This wasn't just preservation. This was healing. And it wasn't only about Elijah anymore. Later that week, they began digitizing the letters. Olivia brought her camera and her design software, and together the three generations, Elijah, Camille, and Zora, began building a digital archive. Each letter was scanned, transcribed, and paired with a short note about its origin. The project grew beyond them. Neighbors contributed stories, fellow veterans from the local community center dropped off mementos. A historian from NYU heard about the effort and requested to collaborate. This isn't a museum piece, Camille told him. It's a living record. We're not here to glorify war. We're here to remember what it cost and who paid. So one afternoon, as they worked through a particularly faded envelope, Camille found something unexpected. A torn photograph tucked between the folds. It was of a young black pilot standing beside a white airman, both grinning, arms slung over each other's shoulders, their eyes squinting against the sun. The back read, Elijah and Walt, Anzio, 44. Walt? Camille asked. Elijah took the photo with trembling fingers. Walter Klein. He was from Ohio. We bunked together for a while. He taught me how to play chess, and I taught him how to fix the Mustang's throttle. Did he make it home? Elijah hesitated, then shook his head. We lost him in the Alps. A foggy morning, low visibility. He was covering my flank. Camille saw the grief flicker in his eyes, the kind that never dulls, only quiets. I wrote to his family, he continued. Tried to explain, but words, they never felt enough. That night, Camille added a new folder to the archive. The ones we carried. Inside, she placed the letters written to lost comrades, unsent but still speaking volumes. Words born from memory and longing, never meant to be read, now illuminated by time and love. As spring unfurled over Harlem and cherry blossoms scattered across the sidewalks like confetti, Camille realized something had shifted. The stories Elijah had buried out of fear they'd be misunderstood had finally found an audience ready to hear them, not in classrooms or press conferences, but in kitchens, living rooms, and community centers, where legacies truly lived. When a local school asked if Elijah would speak during Black History Month, Camille saw him hesitate. I don't need a stage, he murmured. You don't, Camille agreed. But they do. He went. Zora introduced him. And as he shared his story, not of medals, but of moments, not of battles, but of letters never sent, a silence fell over the room. The kind that meant someone was truly listening. That evening, Elijah gave Camille a new envelope. It was addressed, stamped, and sealed. To Clara, the letter I never sent. Camille looked up. I want you to read it at my memorial, he said. Tears welled in her eyes. Grandpa, it's time, he said simply. Some letters are never too late. And in that moment, with the past no longer buried but breathing, Camille understood what it meant to carry history, not as a burden, but as a bridge. A quiet promise between generations that, even in silence, love remembers. And sometimes, the words we never send still find their way home. The gallery's walls were taller than Ava expected, lined with framed memories that seemed to hum with voices no longer present but never quite silent. Camille gently guided her daughter by the hand as they stepped into the space, the murmur of hushed conversation and soft jazz underscoring the gravity of the evening. Olivia had spent over a year curating this exhibition, and tonight it would finally open. An ode not just to history, but to heritage still in motion. They called it Gallery of Echoes. Ava wore a plum dress with a matching velvet ribbon in her hair, but it was the pride in her eyes that glowed brightest. Camille had given her permission to skip school for the occasion, believing that some lessons were better taught in rooms filled with legacy than in classrooms filled with textbooks. She glanced down at her daughter and thought again of Elijah, her grandfather, Ava's great-grandfather, whose presence loomed in every corner of this place, though his physical body remained confined to his brownstone just a few miles away. The space was unlike any Camille had ever entered. It wasn't just about art, it was about truth, resistance, memory. Every photograph, sculpture, and canvas whispered a story. And at the heart of it all, in a spotlight beneath a skylight, hung a life-size portrait of Elijah Thompson in full flight gear, head slightly tilted, expression both commanding and kind. The background had been painted in layers of crimson and smoke gray, symbolizing the danger he flew through and the fire he carried inside. Camille felt her breath catch. Next to her, Ava stared in awe. "Mommy, that's him, isn't it? That's the one from the scrapbook. The picture he never let us frame because he said it wasn't about medals." Camille nodded slowly, moved by how accurately Ava remembered. "He said the sky didn't care about color, only skill." Olivia approached from across the room, dressed in a sharp midnight blue suit, her camera slung casually over one shoulder. She looked both exhausted and radiant, the kind of tired that only comes from building something that matters. Her eyes lit up when she saw Ava. "There's my favorite historian," she said warmly, bending slightly to hug her cousin's daughter. "Ready to see the secret part of the exhibit?" Ava's eyes widened. "There's a secret part?" Olivia smiled. "Come on, it's not on the map, but I made it for you, for all of us." They passed through the gallery's main halls, each room curated by theme: airborne courage, segregated sacrifice, and a particularly haunting section called After the Parade Ends, which chronicled the quiet aftermath of returning Black veterans in a segregated America. But Olivia led them to a small room tucked in the back, one most guests would miss. Inside was a circular space, its walls painted a soft cream. The light was gentler here. On each wall, photographs and handwritten notes were pinned carefully, some faded, some freshly inked. Camille scanned the room and recognized several names: women whose brothers never came back, children who grew up on stories of courage passed down like heirlooms. But what gripped her most was a letter written in her own handwriting, displayed at eye level. It was the letter she'd never sent to her grandfather. She remembered writing it one late night in Atlanta just after Zora was born, when she was overwhelmed by the fear that she couldn't raise a daughter in a world that felt too cruel and complicated. She had poured every doubt, every hope, every unspoken thank you into that letter, but never mailed it. Camille stared at it, stunned. Olivia gently touched her arm. "I found it in the envelope at his desk. He kept it. I asked him if I could include it here. He said yes, but only if you saw it first." Camille's throat tightened. "Why would he keep it? I never even signed it." "Because he didn't need your signature to know it was love," Olivia said. Ava walked slowly around the room, reading each note aloud with a reverence that made Camille's heart ache and swell at the same time. The words were simple but powerful, messages to fathers, uncles, and grandmothers. Some were apologies, others were promises. At the center of the room stood a glass case. Inside, Ava found a pair of pilot's gloves, worn, cracked, stained at the fingertips. A small plaque read, "Worn by Captain Elijah Thompson, carried through 73 missions, given to his granddaughter on the day she started her first job." Camille blinked in disbelief. "Those were in my desk drawer. I didn't know he kept the originals. I thought—" Olivia's voice was quiet. "He said legacy doesn't belong in safes. It belongs in stories." Tears welled in Camille's eyes. I didn't realize how much he thought I was carrying forward. He saw it even when you didn't, Olivia replied. A slow trickle of visitors began to enter the room. Some moved to silence, others quietly taking notes or wiping their eyes. A teacher gently directed a group of high schoolers toward the walls, encouraging them to read the letters aloud. One teenage boy stood before the gloves and whispered, "My uncle flew too. They never let him talk about it." This helps. Later that evening, after the crowd had thinned and the city had darkened outside the gallery windows, the family sat together on a bench in the room of unsent letters. Camille leaned into Olivia. Ava nestled between them, her head heavy with sleep and her heart full. I used to think the most important stories were the ones that made it into history books, Camille murmured. Turns out, Olivia said, they're also the ones hidden in drawers, whispered at dinner tables, and saved in a grandparent's handwriting. Ava stirred. Mommy, when I grow up, I'm going to tell my kids about this night, and I'll make sure they know what it means. Camille kissed the top of her daughter's head. Then this gallery did its job. Outside, the gallery lights dimmed to a gentle glow. Inside, the voices of those who were never given the chance to speak filled the space, not with anger, but with presence. Not with bitterness, but with remembrance. In the gallery of echoes, silence no longer meant absence. It meant reverence. And through it all, Ava's voice, quiet, steady, carried forward the truth that some stories are too vital to stay hidden, some names too sacred to fade, because sometimes the future listens best in a room full of echoes. The afternoon light filtered through the lace curtains of the brownstone, casting soft patterns on the worn floorboards. Ava sat at the old oak table, her legs swinging above the ground, a pen gripped tightly in her fingers. Before her lay a fresh page of her composition notebook, the words at the top neatly underlined, "Why my great-grandfather is my hero." She glanced over at the living room, where Elijah was napping in his favorite armchair, the rhythm of his breathing calm and steady. Camille watched her daughter from the kitchen, the smell of cornbread baking in the oven wrapping the home in warmth. It had been 4 months since Camille decided to make Harlem their new home. The transition had not come without cost. Atlanta had been more than a city. It had been her fortress, her launch pad. But in the quiet that followed the whirlwind of their move, Camille began to see how different a life could be when roots were nourished instead of constantly repotted. It wasn't only for Ava, it was for her too. She had been chasing something for so long, unaware that part of her had always been circling back to this place. The community had welcomed them with open arms, not because they were perfect or well known, but because legacy resonated through the very walls of their home. Elijah had become something of a living legend among the neighborhood children who came by often to sit on the porch steps, listening wide-eyed to his stories. Ava had begun helping her great-grandfather catalog memories, labeling photographs, sorting old medals, and digitizing recorded interviews. Camille sometimes found herself quietly observing the two of them, feeling like she was watching time fold in on itself, bridging generations in real time. What surprised Camille most wasn't the depth of Elijah's war stories or even the grace with which he shared them, but the quieter lessons he imparted. One evening, while Ava was upstairs working on a class project, Elijah leaned in and said, "You know, child, history's not just what gets written in books. It's what we pass down when nobody's watching. The quiet truths, the unspoken faith. That's the legacy that lasts." Camille thought about those words often. At her new office in Manhattan, she found herself bringing a new kind of energy into the boardroom. She advocated for mentorship programs rooted in cultural awareness, insisted on inclusive storytelling and campaigns, and started an employee resource group focused on Black legacy and innovation in the workplace. What had once felt like a job now felt like a platform, and she stepped into it not only as a professional, but as a daughter, a mother, and a keeper of stories. Olivia's photography exhibit had gone on to tour other cities, Chicago, Los Angeles, even a small gallery in Birmingham. Her work was praised not only for its artistry, but for its emotional depth. The portraits of Tuskegee Airmen descendants were haunting in their simplicity yet rich with narrative. One photo, in particular, had captured national attention, a black and white image of Ava looking out of the window of the brownstone, her face reflected faintly in the glass, Elijah visible in the background, hand on her shoulder. It had been featured in several magazines, captioned with a single phrase, "Tomorrow's legacy begins today." Schools began requesting Olivia and Camille to speak together, one as an artist, the other as a professional advocate. They would tell audiences of all ages about the importance of identity, of knowing where you come from so you can choose where to go. Ava often came along, sometimes reading short excerpts from the letters Elijah had received from fellow veterans and their families. Her voice was still young, still high and filled with wonder, but she spoke with the kind of grounded presence that made people stop and listen. One chilly November morning, as the family prepared for a community event honoring Harlem's local veterans, Camille discovered a small package addressed to Ava. Inside was a delicate chain with a silver pendant in the shape of a wing. Along with it, a note in careful handwriting. For the girl who carries stories with grace. From a pilot's granddaughter who never forgot, Eleanor Whitley. Ava wore it every day after that. At the community center, a new wing had been named in honor of Elijah Thompson. There was a mural along the hallway featuring key moments from his life, flying with the 332nd Fighter Group, returning home to a segregated America, raising a family with quiet strength. Ava had painted one of the panels herself, depicting a young girl standing on a porch holding her great-grandfather's hand. She titled it Holding History. As part of the dedication ceremony, Camille was asked to give a speech. She stood at the podium with Ava and Elijah seated in the front row, Olivia behind them with her camera poised. Camille looked out at the audience, her voice steady as she began. We are gathered here not just to honor a man, but to recognize the generations he shaped. Captain Elijah Thompson didn't seek glory. He sought dignity. He flew not just to defend a country that denied him equal rights, but to pave a path for those who came after him. And today, that path winds through every story we carry, every truth we choose to tell, every hand we hold as we walk forward. She paused, locking eyes with her daughter. Legacy is not inherited. It is chosen, cultivated, protected. And when we pass it on with love, it becomes a light that no injustice can dim. The applause that followed was warm and full, not thunderous, but reverent. When Camille stepped down from the stage, Elijah reached for her hand, his fingers weak but insistent. You did good, little one, he said. Real good. Later that night, back at the brownstone, Camille found Ava asleep on the couch, the pendant resting against her chest, a sketchbook open on her lap. In it was a drawing, simple but powerful. It showed a tall tree with deep roots beneath the earth, and instead of leaves, the branches held faces. At the top, illuminated by a soft sun, was a single word, tomorrow. Camille closed the sketchbook gently, her heart full. The stories were no longer just in the past. They lived in her daughter's hands, in her cousin's art, in the changed lives they touched, and in the unwavering eyes of a man who once flew through hostile skies not just to protect, but to prove. Elijah's health began to fade more quickly after the dedication. The cold winter months pressed heavily against his lungs, and though his mind remained sharp, his body surrendered, bit by bit. One snowy evening, as Camille tucked him into bed, he whispered, Don't let them forget. Not me, not the others. "You have my word," she replied, tears stinging the corners of her eyes. He passed quietly 2 weeks later, with Ava beside him, her hand resting in his. His funeral was attended by dignitaries, veterans, neighbors, and children he had once inspired with his stories. As his casket was lowered into the earth, Camille held her daughter close and whispered, "We carry him forward now." Spring arrived slowly, unfolding soft blossoms across the Harlem streets. The brownstone remained alive with memory, its rooms filled with the sound of Ava's laughter, the scratch of her pen, the soft click of Olivia's camera. Legacy, Camille had learned, was not a thing of the past. It was the way you woke each morning and chose to stand, speak, and love. And in that legacy, they found not just history, but hope, not just memory, but momentum. And in the light of tomorrow, they walked forward, hand in hand. The afternoon sun slanted through the high windows of the Harlem brownstone, warming the wooden floors and casting golden shadows across the living room where Ava sat, carefully placing another letter into a plastic sleeve. She had grown taller over the past few months, her face more defined, her gaze steadier. Her grandfather's archive had become more than a project. It was now a ritual. Every afternoon after school, she and Camille would work side by side, cataloging, transcribing, and preserving the letters Elijah Thompson had once hidden in drawers and boxes, unsure the world was ready to hear them. Since Elijah's passing, the house had taken on a new rhythm. There was silence now in the rooms where his voice once hummed, but it wasn't empty. It was full of presence. His favorite chair still sat in the corner, a folded Tuskegee Airman blanket draped across the back. His medals were no longer stored in drawers but arranged carefully in a shadow box on the hallway wall. Camille often paused in front of them in the mornings, coffee in hand, as if grounding herself before the day began. Camille had kept her word. She didn't let anyone forget. The dedication ceremony at the Harlem Community Center had not been the end. It had been the beginning. What followed was a groundswell of interest in Elijah's story, and, more importantly, in the untold stories of men like him. Requests poured in from schools, museums, veterans organizations. Olivia's photography exhibit expanded, now incorporating audio recordings Camille had digitized. Elijah's voice, gravelly but calm, describing what it felt like to fly through enemy skies while fighting for dignity back home. And then there was Ava. At 10 years old, she had become a steward of memory. Her school project on the Tuskegee Airmen had transformed into a district-wide initiative called Legacy Letters, encouraging students to interview family members, collect oral histories, and submit them to a growing online archive. The project had drawn media attention, and soon Camille found herself speaking on panels about intergenerational legacy, Black history education, and the power of remembering. Camille had thought that staying in New York would mean sacrificing her trajectory, but what she found instead was a new path, one where purpose and profession finally aligned. Her new role at Horizon Media was focused on cultural equity and historical storytelling, and for the first time in years, she felt at peace with where she was and who she was becoming. One crisp October morning, Camille and Ava stood in front of the brownstone, waiting for a car to take them to the opening of a new exhibit at the National Museum of African American History and Culture. The Smithsonian had reached out months earlier, requesting to feature Elijah's letters, uniform, and a portion of the oral recordings. It would be the first time a full personal archive of a Tuskegee Airman's life, beyond medals and missions, was presented through the eyes of his descendants. Ava clutched a small envelope in her hands. Inside was the letter she had written to Elijah the day after he died. She had never read it aloud, not even to Camille, but now, standing in her yellow dress and navy blazer, she whispered, "I think I'm ready." Camille looked at her daughter and nodded, pride and awe swelling in her chest. He would be too. The exhibit, titled Legacy in the Light of Tomorrow, was a stunning display of family artifacts, letters, photographs, and audio set against a backdrop of historical context. Visitors moved quietly through the space, stopping to listen to Elijah's voice as it echoed softly from hidden speakers. One recording played him describing a mission over Italy. Another, more intimate, was him reading one of the unsent letters, a goodbye he had written to Camille's grandmother, Clara, when he thought he wouldn't make it home. At the center of the exhibit stood a sculpture commissioned by Olivia, a bronze tree with roots that stretched across the floor and branches that reached the ceiling. Each root bore an inscription of a Tuskegee airman's name. Each branch held etched quotes from descendants. Camille's quote read, "Some legacies are planted in silence and bloom in the voices of those brave enough to speak." Ava's read simply, "He flew so I could rise." As part of the opening ceremony, the museum had invited Camille and Ava to speak. Olivia would present the visual story, and together the three women, granddaughter, great-granddaughter, and niece, would bring Elijah's journey full circle. When it was Ava's turn to read, she stepped up to the podium, the envelope still in her hands. She unfolded the letter, took a breath, and began. "Dear Great-Grandpa, you probably already know everything I'm about to say, but Mommy says sometimes the act of saying it matters just as much. So here it is. Thank you for being brave when the world didn't treat you like a hero. Thank you for showing us how to stand tall, even when no one else will stand with you. Thank you for teaching me that flying is not just about being in the sky. It's about rising above everything that tries to hold you down. You said the sky didn't care what color you were, but I think the world is starting to. At least a little more. And I think that's because people like you flew anyway. Love, Ava." When she finished, the room was still, not quiet from discomfort, but from reverence. Then the applause came, not loud and thunderous, but steady and heartfelt. Camille stood beside her daughter, tears tracing her cheeks, and took her hand. That evening, back at the brownstone, they lit candles by Elijah's photo. Camille placed a copy of Ava's letter beside it. Legacy had always seemed like something that belonged to the past, but now, in the soft flicker of candlelight and the determined gaze of a child, Camille saw it clearly. Legacy was alive, breathing, becoming. The world might still have far to go, but thanks to Elijah Thompson and the generations who followed him, the future was no longer untethered from its roots. It had found its place in the light of tomorrow. In the span of just a few days, a quiet, determined 8-year-old girl in a lavender hoodie unknowingly sparked a ripple that traveled far beyond the cabin of a commercial airplane. Ava Thompson's journey began with something as seemingly simple as a request to switch seats, a moment many might consider ordinary, even dismissible. But behind that request lived something deeper, something systemic. And what followed was not just a refusal to be displaced, but the quiet unfolding of a legacy that refused to be forgotten. This is not just a story about a girl and her mother taking a trip to Washington, D.C. It's a story about lineage, memory, and how the past often walks beside us in ways we don't recognize until we are forced to sit still and listen. When Ava's mother, Camille, stood her ground against the subtle pressure to relocate, she did more than protect her daughter's comfort. She protected their place in a long, often unspoken history. Captain Elijah Thompson, Ava's great-grandfather, had once flown skies that refused to see past his skin. He defended a country that did not yet defend him. He saved lives in enemy territory while being denied basic dignity on the ground. His story, like so many of the Tuskegee Airmen and black soldiers of his era, was etched in silence, preserved only in folded letters, whispered memories, and the resolve of those who bore his name. That history began to breathe again on that flight, when a seasoned flight attendant recognized the name Thompson and remembered the heroism it carried. The recognition spread, first among crew members, then to fellow passengers, and finally into the hands of a curious little girl who carried her stuffed lion like a torch through generations of silence. As Ava listened to her great-grandfather recount tales he'd once buried beneath medals and folded uniforms, she began to understand the weight of legacy. It wasn't something static, a photograph or a name carved in stone. It was a living, evolving force. In her quiet questions and wide-eyed wonder, she did something remarkable. She gave voice to the past and shape to the future. Camille, once laser-focused on her rising career and survival as a single mother, began to see the strength in slowing down. Her grandfather's Harlem brownstone, filled with the echoes of Langston Hughes and Thurgood Marshall, became more than a nostalgic reminder of where she came from. It became a call to ground herself and her daughter in the truth of who they were. Olivia, the cousin whose path had once diverged into silence, reconnected through art and memory, using photography not just to frame moments, but to rebuild broken bridges within their family. Her exhibition, Gallery of Echoes, celebrated the untold descendants of greatness, casting light on the invisible threads that connect generations. And then came the decision, the one that changed everything. Camille turned down a major promotion. She chose to stay, not because she had to, but because she realized that legacy doesn't flourish in absence. It grows in proximity, in shared meals, in bedtime stories, in the unspoken handoff between generations. Ava, now deeply rooted in her family's past, transformed into more than a child along for the ride. She became a steward of remembrance. Her school project blossomed into a community-wide exhibition honoring the Tuskegee Airmen. The scrapbook of letters her great-grandfather once kept in private became a public archive, and her yellow dress, once a child's favorite color, now symbolized something much greater: joy, resilience, and the light that can emerge when truth is honored. So what can we, as viewers and readers, take away from Ava's journey? The lesson is this: legacy is not what we inherit, it's what we choose to carry forward. It's in the names we whisper, the stories we retell, the history we refuse to let fade into silence. It is in the moments we choose courage over convenience, clarity over comfort. It's in standing our ground not just for ourselves, but for those who walk before us and those still learning how to walk beside us. In a world moving faster by the day, it's easy to let history collect dust. But stories like Ava's remind us that we have a responsibility, not just to remember, but to act, to elevate the voices of those who were once silenced, to recognize that our presence in a room, on a plane, in a board meeting, or in a classroom is not random. It's part of a larger narrative, one that we are shaping, whether we realize it or not. And so, as you close this story, ask yourself, what legacy are you carrying? Whose name do you speak into the world? And how can you use your seat, wherever it may be, not just to exist, but to honor, to resist, and to uplift? Let's keep the light of memory alive. Together, let's build a world where every name is honored, every voice is heard, and no legacy is ever left behind. If this story touched your heart, don't forget to subscribe to our channel. Your support gives us the motivation to keep creating powerful, meaningful content that inspires and uplifts.